Thank you for coming. I know it's a little bit early. So, for those of you who are somewhat familiar with me, my research tends to focus on the interaction between people and landscapes, and specifically I'm interested in long-term impacts of those interactions and the legacies that are created from those. And legacies are defined as long-term interspecific effects that persist after the causal species or organism is gone or ceases the activity. Now, Bill Willey actually said this in a much more beautiful way. He described landscapes as areas of interaction where past events have been inscribed, sometimes subtly, on the land. And so this, made me realize that landscape, when you think about these legacies around the world, there's a wide diversity of these things. You find them all over the place. So, for example, this is, oh dang, I taught myself how to say this and then I've forgotten. Okay, I'm going to butcher that. This forest in France, so it's the largest oak forest in Europe. It is the source, if you are a wine lover, it's the source of fine oak wine barrels. And for the longest time was believed to be an uncut primary forest. Until recently, when we found about 108 Roman agricultural settlement centers. And so they have discovered that when they started doing these excavations, people started to look at the species compositions of plants that were within these settlement areas, and then as you moved out from the center of the Roman agricultural area and out, away from it, what they discovered was that the agricultural activities of Romans, which ceased around 4th century, were still persistent in, the effects of these were still persistent in the soils. And this led to a difference in species richness and species composition as you moved from the center of the agricultural areas and out into the forest proper. And similarly, a really fascinating study in Kenya. So, starting around 3,000 years ago, Neolithic pastoralists who were like herders at the time, had consistent herding areas where they would bring animals in and pen them up in consistent areas over time. And what this resulted in was a buildup of dung, which then altered the soil. And isotopic analysis shows us that you can actually trace these dung deposits in the soil. And this has led to these little fertile hotspots, these grassy hotspots in this relatively infertile, scrubby area. And so this is about 3,000 years before present, and they're still persistent. And then if you've seen the top before, another legacy is in the Maya area. And so in my dissertation work, I found that working in an ancient Maya site of Pilar on the Belize-Guatemala border, I found a significant difference in tree species composition between areas of ancient Maya residents and the forest matrix, or areas where there's little to no evidence of ancient Maya residential settlement. And this difference in composition is driven by a higher abundance of species that were utilized by the Maya in Maya tree gardens, these residential home gardens, in the residential areas, as opposed to the forest matrix. And in fact, 8 of those species were significant indicator species of Maya residential areas, such that if you wandered into the forest today and you saw these 8 species, you would know that you were in an ancient Maya residential area, even if you didn't have a handy archaeologist with you. And so, this diversity of legacies around the world in diverse environments and different cultures, this led us to ask, how do we address this question of legacies when in all these diverse systems within a common framework to help us to find the similarities and the common languages between these different legacies. And so we are arguing that one of the ways that we think would be really good to do this is through a dynamic systems framework. Now, a dynamic systems framework actually was developed initially in physics. It was to describe the dynamics of systems ecosystems over time, these changing environments. But it's since been used in a wide variety of contexts. And so it actually has recently been used in a paper looking at socio-ecological environments. And so we're talking about the combination of diverse environments, diverse cultures, and diverse histories. And it gives us this common language to work together. And so the baseline of this is to imagine, it's sort of like a ball just rolling around in this hilly landscape, right? So the ball is the item that you wish to study. For example, the abundance of a species or a certain species, or perhaps use values. And now the x-axis, or the solid line, that represents the status of your variable that you are interested in. And then the landscape itself is created by what are called the external factors. So a dynamic system then is comprised of all the state variables, those variables that you're interested in studying. Like for example, like I said, species composition or abundance or something like that. And the state variables then they have these relatively fast feedbacks. They change over time. So as you can see, like changes in species abundances over time is something that people have been studying a lot. We all know that those can actually be altered by, a dry season, for example. So they're pretty quick feedback systems. And they then are related very strongly to that curved line, which is created, that context of that curved line is created by the external factors. And these external factors would be things like soil parent material. So these external factors are very slow changing variables. So in relation to generally our system states, our state variables, you consider them in some ways as essentially permanent. They have sort of the parameters of the model in which the state variables are interested in, that rolling ball, are moving about. And so when you look at these, you see these varieties of things, you end up when that ball moves. So that gray line is the ball in a past state, or the gray ball, I should say. And the black ball is where we're looking at it right now. And so what was moving that black ball then would be perturbations. Now if you had some sort of perturbation, say a fire or a logging activity, that perturbation is then going to move the ball. So let's say it moves from x to x prime. So there will be a change in perhaps your species composition. And so if the perturbation is relatively small, then the ball over time, your composition will eventually move back to its stable equilibrium point, which was represented by the initial location of the ball, with that low point in the curved lines. Now, if your perturbation is stronger, is a larger perturbation, then it can actually push your state variable up out of that local equilibrium, and when the perturbation ends, the ball can then settle into an alternative basin of equilibrium, a basin of attraction. Now, alternatively, there can even be a perturbation which can actually alter the external variables themselves. So, for example, imagine, as we were talking before, when Dr. Lentz and others were talking about how you'd have major erosion or soil differences, and that can actually change the landscape itself. And thus, then that would actually move the ball into a new stable equilibrium and alter the system altogether. So these are different, we're calling the type 1, 2, and 3, different ways of envisioning this dynamic system. And so just to put this into context, a well-known legacy that would work really well within a dynamic system framework would be Amazonian dark earths, which I think we're all very familiar with. These are pockets of fertile soil that are located throughout the Amazon that have anthropogenic origin. And these things date, starting on the Holocene, the largest and the number of them are created at about 1000 BCE in that arena. And these things are characterized by both very high labile and stable soil organic matter, as well as a high cation exchange capacity. As you can see here, the two different, you see the standard Amazonian soil is the lighter colored, oxasols, ferrosols, things that are relatively nutrient poor, and then Amazon dark earth, these charcoal enriched organic soils. And so you can actually see also that you have that PCA showing you that the distinction between the triangles, which are the ADE soils that have much higher nutrient compositions. And these in the soils actually leads to a significant difference in species composition. So on the left, you see from Juncker et al. In 2010 with woody vegetation and palms. You can see the Amazonian soils, or the Amazonian dark earths, is TPI. I have no idea why they didn't just call them APEs, but whatever. And then the NAS, or the non-anthropogenic soils. And so you can see very distinct species compositions, both in woody vegetation, palms as well. And then interestingly, Demetrios et al. Actually looked at this in terms of microorganisms and other organisms like earthworms, for example. And you can see just different species compositions in ADE soils versus the baseline soils. And what's really amazing, what's really interesting about this is the charcoal that's driving this is sort of the basis of these ADE soils, has an extremely long residence time, in the order of millennia. And so because of this really long, it actually leads to a situation where the soils can have been altered to the point where we have changed the parameters of the system. They have, the residence time of these charcoals has made them so much longer than the variation time within the biota that you can almost imagine them as a new parameter. So this is a change to the parameters. So this would be what we would call a type 3 dynamic system effect. So I mentioned before the work that I did in Belize and Guatemala. So in this situation, what I found, like I said, different species composition that was significantly different between residential areas and non-residential areas. However, doing an analysis of the soils, I found that very little of that was actually explained by soil differences. Now, there are plenty of other studies showing that in some areas the Maya did alter the soils, and they could be considered a type 3 effect. But in this case, we did not find evidence for that. We found very little difference. Only about 5% of the variation in species composition could be explained by soils. And so in fact, what we are hypothesizing is that, that this effect in this site is what's been called a type 2, or effect, which is an alternative basin of attraction impact. And so what we mean by that, remember that there was a perturbation which ceased and that moved, and then the ball moved itself into a new alternative basin. And so this is actually really difficult to demonstrate. So because of the fact that variables the external system have to stay unchanged, and variables within the system show these feedbacks, and there have to be these 2 or more basins. There's a whole literature on that. If you want more on that, you can talk to me or my collaborator, Dr. Stevens. But what we are actually hypothesizing is that the ancient Maya established these plant communities, that are supported by these plant fruit or mutualism. So it's actually biotic interactions which are driving this change. Now, zoochory, or plant dispersal, is ubiquitous throughout the tropics. And so, what this generally centers around are what are generalist species. So these are house species that interact with the diversity of other species. They form the core of these plant and disperser communities, or plant pollinator communities. In our case, from some of the work that actually Dr. Stevens will talk about later, Dendropanix arboreus is actually a species which has a lot of spatial connections with other species, more than any other species. And this is a species that is dispersed by over 50 different kinds of birds, produces a ton of little fruits. And so it's a really important generalist species. And so bird orchards are areas that have been argued as being areas where when you have a collection of frugivorous species that are dispersed by animals, then you end up bringing in a whole variety of dispersers, and those dispersers then, have a variety of other species. And so you can imagine a Venn diagram of all the species that are dispersed by this collection of species that are all directed to this generalist, as well as their other favored species. And so the idea, in the residential areas, Dendropanix is 3 times more common in the residential area than non-residential areas. And so then they're bringing in their dispersers, and they are, but then when you have more dispersers, what this ends up doing then, when you have this large collection of fruit trees, then you end up bringing in even more species that are less commonly going to be dispersing that species, but they also have other species that they are doing. And so what you end up with is them bringing in a whole bunch of new plant species, and you get this positive feedback building in the system, and you create a system that maintains itself. And so this is our hypothesis of this. Holy goodness. And so that's that. So what's the strength of this? Well, the strength of this idea we're arguing is that this places all these legacy effects, these diverse legacy effects, into a common framework, into a common language with well-established tools. This way we can communicate with other disciplines, and we can actually use these ideas to communicate across boundaries and across environments. And so they can complement our current research on looking at both uniqueness of these locations as well as the things that they share in common. So thank you.